Number 10, woolly mammoths outlive pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2500 BCE. Egyptian workers were hauling limestone blocks under the desert sun, building what would become one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And at that exact same moment in history, woolly mammoths were still alive, not as fossils, but alive and kicking, patrolling around the Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean. The last of these prehistoric Ice Age creatures didn't go extinct until around 1700 BCE, a full 800 years after the pyramids were finished. Think about that gap. Pharaohs were ruling Egypt, hieroglyphics were being carved into temple walls, and somewhere far to the north, a small population of woolly mammoths was still trudging through the snow. We think of mammoths as belonging to some impossibly ancient era, cavemen huddled around fires painting them on cave walls. But the truth is, these creatures survived well into what we'd call civilization. The pyramids and the last mammoths weren't separated by eons, they were separated by less time than the entire history of the United States. Number 9. Nintendo was founded during Jack the Ripper's killing spree. In 1889, a small playing card company opened in Kyoto, Japan. The owner, Fusajiro Yamauchi, hand-painted traditional Hanafuda cards for gamblers. That company was Nintendo. That same year, newspapers in London were still running headlines about Jack the Ripper. The Autumn of Terror murders had happened just months earlier in 1888, and the killer was never caught. The city was gripped by fear and fascination, so when you think of Nintendo, you probably think of Mario, Zelda, the Nintendo Switch, modern day video games. But Nintendo is older than your great-great-grandparents. It was born in the era of gaslight streets, horse-drawn carriages, and one of history's most notorious unsolved murder cases. Queen Victoria was still on the throne, the Eiffel Tower had just been completed, and a Japanese card company that will one day define video games was getting its start in a world that had never even imagined electricity in homes, let alone handheld gaming devices. Nintendo outlasted empires, survived two world wars, and transformed itself from a gambling accessory into a cultural force, all because someone decided to make cards in the same year a serial killer terrorized Victorian London. Number 8. The telephone was invented before the completion of the Great Wall. The Great Wall of China is one of the most ancient structures humans ever built. Construction started in the 7th century BCE. Dynasties rose and fell, emperors came and went, and the wall just kept growing, snaking across mountains and deserts. But here's the thing, the wall wasn't actually finished until 1878 during the Qing dynasty. That's not ancient history, that's modern history. Because just 2 years earlier, in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell picked up his experimental device and spoke the first words ever transmitted by telephone. The telephone existed before the Great Wall was complete. Let that sink in. A structure we think of as ancient, something that is written in history textbooks next to Roman aqueducts and Egyptian obelisks, was still actively being built when people were already inventing devices that would eventually let you FaceTime someone on the other side of the planet. It's crazy to think that the Great Wall of China, which is now one of the seven wonders of the world, is from the same era as when phones were invented. Number 7. Machu Picchu and the Sistine Chapel were finished within a century of each other. Machu Picchu, the stone citadel perched high in the Andes Mountains of Peru, was completed around 1450. It was built at the height of the Inca Empire, a society that never developed the wheel or written language, yet somehow engineered structures so precise that you can't fit a knife blade between the stones. Halfway across the world, Michelangelo was lying on his back on scaffolding inside the Sistine Chapel, painting the ceiling that would become one of the most famous artworks in human history. He finished in 1512. That's just 62 years apart. The Inca were carving terraces into mountains while Michelangelo was mixing pigments in Rome. These weren't distant civilizations separated by millennia, they were contemporaries. If an Inca architect and Michelangelo had somehow met, they could have compared notes on their respective projects. And these two vastly different cultures, 6,500 miles apart, were creating masterpieces at the same time. Number 6. Coca-Cola is older than the Eiffel Tower. In May 1886, a pharmacist named John Pemberton mixed up a syrup in Atlanta, Georgia. He was trying to create a medicinal tonic, something to cure headaches and give people energy. He added carbonated water, and the first glass of Coca-Cola was served at Jacob's Pharmacy. 3 years later, in 1889, Gustave Eiffel finished constructing his Iron Tower in Paris for the World's Fair. When Parisians looked up at the newly completed Eiffel Tower for the first time, Coca-Cola had already been sold for 3 years. The drink is older than one of the world's most iconic landmarks. We think of Coca-Cola as quintessentially modern, a product of 20th century advertising and global capitalism. And we think of the Eiffel Tower as an iconic historical landmark of old Europe. But the soda came first. It sounds kind of unbelievable that the beverage you can buy at any gas station predates the structure that defines the Paris skyline. Number 5. Harriet Tubman lived to see Thomas Edison's light bulb. Harriet Tubman was born into slavery around 1820. She escaped in 1849 and spent the next decade leading others to freedom through the Underground Railroad. The world she moved through was lit by lanterns, torches, and candles. In 1880, Thomas Edison patented the practical incandescent light bulb. Streets began glowing with electric light. Homes that had relied on candles for thousands of years suddenly had switches on the wall, and Harriet Tubman was still alive to see it. She didn't die until 1913, at roughly 93 years old. She lived long enough to see automobiles, airplanes, movies, and recorded music. The woman who guided people to freedom by the light of the North Star lived to see a world where you could flip a switch and banish darkness entirely. Her life spanned from a time when people measured distance by how far a horse could travel to a time when the Wright brothers had already flown at Kitty Hawk. She bridged two entirely different worlds, and she did it all in one lifetime. Number 4. The Titanic sank the same year Oreo cookies were invented. On April 15th, 1912, the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank into the North Atlantic. Over 1,500 people died. It was one of the deadliest maritime disasters in history, a tragedy that shook the world and changed how we thought about safety, hubris, and technology. That same year, the Nabisco company introduced a new cookie. 2 chocolate wafers with a sweet cream filling in between. They called it the Oreo. While families were mourning the loss of loved ones on the Titanic, other families were sitting at kitchen tables dunking Oreos in milk for the first time. Tragedy and innovation don't take turns. They happen simultaneously. History isn't respectful. It doesn't pause one event so another can have its moment. The Titanic and the Oreo share the same birth year. One became a symbol of human fallibility. The other became the best-selling cookie in the world. Both are still famous over a century later for completely opposite reasons. Number 3. Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born the same year. Anne Frank was born on June 12, 1929 in Frankfurt, Germany. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. Same year, just months apart. We think of them as belonging to completely different eras because their stories feel so distant. Anne hiding in an attic in Amsterdam, writing in her diary while Nazi soldiers searched for her family. Martin standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, delivering his famous "I have a dream" to hundreds of thousands, but they were the same age. They grew up in the same world, shaped by the same global forces: the Great Depression, the rise of fascism, and the desperation that makes people look for someone to blame. Anne died at 15 in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in 1945. Martin was murdered at 39 on a hotel balcony in Memphis in 1968. Both killed by hate. Both left behind words that changed the world. If circumstances had been different, they could have met, they could have talked. Two voices fighting for human dignity, born into the same broken world at the same broken moment. Their lives weren't separated by history, they were woven into the same tragic, hopeful fabric. Number two, the Ottoman Empire existed when the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. The Chicago Cubs won the World Series in 1908. They wouldn't win another for 108 years, the longest championship drought in professional sports history. That same year, the Ottoman Empire was still standing. The empire that had lasted for over 600 years, that had once laid siege to Vienna and controlled vast stretches of Europe, Asia, and Africa, was still governed by a sultan in Constantinople. American baseball fans were celebrating in the streets while one of history's great empires was entering its final decade. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse until after World War I in 1922. Cubs fans waited longer for another championship than the Ottoman Empire survived after 1908. Think about that. A sports curse outlasted an empire, and it's kind of wild to think that an empire that began in the 13th century existed in the same timeline as baseball. Number one, world's first subway opened during the American Civil War. On January 10th, 1863, the world's first underground railway opened in London. Thousands of people crammed into steam-powered trains, traveling from Paddington to Farringdon in a revolutionary new way. It was a marvel of Victorian engineering, a solution to London's traffic and congestion problem. That same month, in the United States, the Civil War was tearing the country apart. The Emancipation Proclamation had just been signed on January 1st. The Battle of Gettysburg was still 6 months away. Soldiers were dying in muddy fields while London commuters were riding trains through tunnels under the city. One country was building the future. The other was fighting over whether human beings could own other human beings. It's shocking that the London Underground and the Civil War share the year 1863. One represents humanity's ability to solve problems, the other represents humanity's ability to create them. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe to see more.